Academic Authorship with Integrity by Tara Brabazon. Introduction. Integrity for our future. Welcome to this professional development session for higher degree students titled Academic Authorship with Integrity. My name is Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. This session is developed as a professional development program and each of our 7 sections focuses on a particular topic. It may be the development of skills for note-taking, understanding the difference between paraphrasing and plagiarism, and even exploring what your examiners are looking for when they assess your references. And this program is specifically constructed for you, for our higher degree students. Hello. The goal is that we understand academic authorship, and that we all become an academic author with integrity. You will hear about both academic and research integrity in these sessions, and there's a reason for that, because we live in incredibly tough times, from September 11 to the global financial crisis to Donald Trump, Brexit, climate emergencies, the war in Ukraine, the Freedom Convoy, the occupation of Wellington's Parliament Square, COVID-19 and beyond. Whatever your political view, these events agitated the foundations of our lives, including our research lives. So who are we? What do we stand for? What is the role of research and academic writing in our world today? How do we understand ourselves and others? How do we reconcile arguments and reconcile arguments and research with which we disagree? How do we think, develop, understand and transform? How can we become open to critique and questioning? How do we validate expertise? How do we value knowledge? What is in the public good? Indeed, what is the public good? These are powerful questions for citizens, for scholars, and they are crucial to PhD students as they think about their research and becoming researchers. But in tough times, we need to commit to research, to rigour, to the verification of ideas. In tough times for our universities, in a tough time for scholars, it is the moment to discuss the foundational concepts of learning, research and writing. Together, let's explore authorship, research integrity and academic integrity. Each of the 7 sections that follow is written of a length so that it can accompany you on a commute or during a walk, or you can listen to it on a treadmill during your morning exercise. So let's walk together and think about academic authorship with integrity. Let's probe the value of academic authorship with integrity for our future and the future of knowledge. Now, this introduction explores just one big word, an important word that is the foundation for authorship, the foundation of integrity, indeed the foundation of learning. And that word is literacy. To paraphrase and change the focus of the late, great Raymond Williams, literacy is one of the 2 or 3 most complex words in the language, because literacy is the act of decoding the world. As we move around our environment, we make meaning in our response to the information provided by our senses. We make sense. We make meaning from this sensory stimulation, and that requires literacies. Put another way, we receive information from what we see, hear, smell, touch and taste. But what do we do with that information? How do we place it into language? How do we evaluate it? How do we encircle this information and make it nest and sit in our current context? Well, that is literacy. Literacy is the basis of academic life. It's the foundation of integrity. It is the base of authorship. It undergirds all our work in this training program. And I think what is interesting is how this provocative and powerful definition of literacy has been reduced in our time to reading and writing. Of course, literacies begin in the family home. We learn about our bodies and how they gather information. Before words, babies cry to convey meaning. They move, they dance. They're learning literacies in rhythm. They gain olfactory and food literacies from what they smell and touch. Through touch, babies learn about hot and cold, safe and dangerous. And growing up is actually growing into literacies. Sadly, we disrespect this incredible knowledge system we gain in the home. And now literacy is located in a hierarchy, and reading and writing are the valued skills. Digital literacies are now becoming a named skill for employment and part of most universities' lists of graduate attributes. Some literacies are taught in formal institutions like schools and universities, and they are often valued over other literacies. So for me, the most important literacy that I believe should be taught overtly is information literacy. It refers to the capacity of a human to learn the skills to learn. This is, of course, the meta-literacy, learning how to find information, but also how to decode it and how to evaluate it, and then move that information and use it for different purposes, but use it for different purposes with integrity and rigour, carrying forward that original context. At its most basic, think about the assessment practices we use in schools and universities. Yes, they're pretty dreadful, lacking diversity, lacking innovation. We become literate in very basic assessment tools. The idea of really challenging students, working through interface management, multimodality, that's pretty well invisible in our universities. Why this is so worrying is think about what is happening in our PhD programs. We are thinking through a diversity lens, not only a diversity of research modes and methodologies, but enabling a diversity of people into our programs. As you can see, information literacy matters a lot. And this is a new way to frame and shape a PhD. Indeed, without information literacy, neither research nor academic integrity can develop. But as we conclude this introduction, it is important to remember that we too often forget literacy development. We may learn reading, writing and note-taking, and then we forget the intellectual scaffolding through which we learn those skills because they are embedded in our academic lives. We need more reflection and consciousness now. And why? Well, research codes of conduct around the world are transforming. Journal submission practices are transforming. Authorship cannot be assumed. It must be proven. It must be verified against very clear criteria. It is the time that we reveal the scaffold of our learning, that we talk about experiments, we talk about fieldwork, and we are accountable for our lab books, our fieldwork notes. We are accountable that our referencing is rigorous, current, and precise. The time for sloppiness, for excuses, for adding your name to a mate's paper, or our mate adding their name to your paper has gone. Lab courtesy has gone. Authorship cartels have gone. We must demonstrate how our research is actioned in and through our authorship. So let's begin our journey through academic authorship with integrity. Part 1. Note-taking during a PhD. PhDs are precious and distinctive. Then they have one characteristic: they make a significant original contribution to knowledge. But this remarkable, extraordinary achievement is based on a series of rudimentary skills, strategies and competencies. So many of these skills are assumed by doctoral candidates, but they also create doubt and worry and fear, particularly if a student thinks they are lacking these competencies. So we're going to work through these competencies together, quietly and carefully, in this professional development program. Great research and great researchers are based on great note-taking. For example, I have hundreds of Word files that are organised by topic and subject, and in each of those files I keep my notes. I have every set of notes from everything I have read since 1991. And I've migrated it from computer to computer to computer. So that means that every research paper, every talk, every lecture that I write, I already have hundreds, or in some cases, thousands of pages of notes. So that's a pretty good start to any research project. A research career begins when we create a niche, a cluster of expertise. And of course, that starts with the PhD. And that PhD begins with the notes that we take for that doctorate. I understand why there is worry about note-taking in doctoral education, because in undergraduate education, there are new realities in the classroom. A large minority of students do not take notes of any kind through an undergraduate semester, arriving at a session and sitting through lectures or tutorials or seminars without a single note being taken on paper, pad or screen. Students have replaced the reading of scholarly books and articles with the reading of PowerPoint notes prepared by teachers. The photographing of slides is merely an extension of these two trajectories, and there are really only two possible interpretations of this note-taking reality. One, students are too lazy to bother writing their own notes. Or secondly, students are so underconfident that they're frightened of missing anything, and now that anything refers to teacher-prepared PowerPoint notes. So what's happening when this group of students enter a doctoral program? Well, as a self-diagnostic, let me ask you 10 questions. And I'm asking you these 10 questions to check in with yourself today and ask yourself if you reveal any of these tendencies. 1. Do you confuse taking notes with highlighting photocopies or annotating Kindle books? In a coursework master's course in the UK that I taught, I asked students to come in and show me their notes and the notes they'd been taking to build up their coursework master's assignments. And the reason I asked these students to see their notes is that I saw that they were unable to sustain an argument. Their paragraphs were short and fragmented. So therefore I asked to just see their notes from the readings. And what I found was that there were no notes. The students pulled out photocopies with a few highlighted sentences. This process, therefore, engages and activates a series of problems. The student then becomes wedded to the original books, the original articles, the original photocopies, but also the researchers just can't build a synthesis. And once the synthesis has been created, how are they then able to arch beyond the scholarship of others and create their own interpretation? One system that works to enable this movement from reading to note-taking is SQ3R. Survey, question, read, recite, review. Question 2. Do you separate your note-taking from the platform on which you are reading? This means, taking notes from readings in a way that is separate from books and articles. So that means we don't write notes on photocopies. We don't annotate the Kindle books. We force ourselves to make decisions about what is important. We separate the intention from the material, so your intention for the material, from the author's intention for the material. Read an article on paper, read it off an iPad, but then take notes on your laptop. This is platform management, interface management, and it's integral to note-taking. Create space between the platform on which you are reading and the platform on which you take notes. Question 3. Does every topic or subject have a separate note file? Insert your notes for every article and every book via topic. Organise your notes by subject rather than by author or date. And this means that over time you have an incredible database of thousands of pages of notes on thousands of articles. The value of these notes is incalculable. These note files may have titles like Groundwater in Indonesia, Marxist Theory, Catabolic Reactions in the Human Body, Classic Mechanics, Boolean Logic. Therefore, you build up your notes and expertise on your subject over time. Question 4. Do you log accurate references? This will save time later. I know this is self-evident, but I've seen so many PhD students spend 2 months at the end of their PhD doing the mind-numbing job of filling in problematic or absent references. So write the reference once. Write it correctly and save yourself 2 months of checking at the end of your candidature. Question 5. Are your notes legible for further use? Legibility matters. Take the time through your note-taking process to make sure that your material is readable and understandable for future use, because note-taking is an activity for the future. Make sure that you future-proof your notes. 6. Are you writing down the key argument of the writer in one sentence? The key challenge in note-taking, in fact, the point of note-taking, is to reduce the length of the original research. And we're reducing the length of that original research to render it in a form that can be used. So note-taking must be short and succinct. It is reusable. And the best way to enact this process is to read the abstract, read the introduction, and read the conclusion. And at that point, write one sentence about the argument of the research, and then write one sentence about how you're going to use that research. Remember, these are notes. The key is to ask, what is the point of the research? Why does the research matter? So you see, right at the start, you're putting your interpretation into your note-taking. Question 7. Do you look at the bibliography or reference list used by the writer, noting the quality and dates of their cited scholarship? A crucial technique of information literacy that is rarely taught is the capacity to evaluate the quality of source material used by a researcher. When an examiner is reading your PhD, they're going to go straight to your bibliography reference list. And I want you to do the same for every piece of research that you read. So when you start reading a piece, look at the reference list first. Make a judgment about the date of the references, you see any blind spots or absences in the research, the biases in the bibliography. Check the quality of your reading material. Is it refereed? What is the scope and the scale of the self-citation? And does the research move between historical important work and current initiatives? Does it move between analogue and digital sources? Question 8. Do you transcribe important quotations accurately, and do you differentiate clearly in your notes between paraphrasing the author and your direct quotations from them? Right. Once you've determined the key argument and the quality of the references, let's talk about quotations. We're going to have a later part that's exploring paraphrasing, plagiarism and quotations, but the major point I want to make early in this professional development program is that if the form and the content of your readings matter to your argument, then make sure you write down quotations, and yes, with inverted commas, and those quotations must be written down accurately. I'm aware that some disciplines naturalise paraphrasing, but please make sure, if you can't paraphrase well or you're working on it now, please write down the quotes with inverted commas, and we'll work on that key first paraphrasing skill. Please read the abstract and write at least one sentence describing the point of the article. 9. Are your notes sufficiently detailed so that you do not need to return to the original text when writing up your chapter, article, or assignment? The whole point of taking notes is brevity. You are not rewriting the article. You must be selective and systematic. And we all need to appreciate and continue to learn about the delicate art of note-taking. Notes need to be short enough so that they're usable, portable, and functional. But they also need to be detailed enough so that they're brief enough that you can put away the book or the article and then still be able to use those notes for future research. So this is the art and the craft of note-taking, and it's learned through practice. Question 10. Are your notes sufficiently brief so that you have not paraphrased the entire article? It's important to always err on the side of brevity of an argument with some accurately transcribed quotations. I know inexperienced or worried students take too many notes. They almost rewrite the entire article. So be confident. We learn to write by writing. We learn to take notes by note-taking. Recognise that taking notes matters. For me, it is a powerful and valuable skill. A professor at Albion Christian University, Bill Rankin, reported about 5 years ago that his students stopped taking notes. And he asked, quote, of his students, quote, why are you not taking notes? And they said, why would we take notes on that? I can go to Wikipedia or go to Google and I can get all the information I need. End of quote. Note-taking is not simply about information. It improves memory. It triggers factual recall. It shapes the interpretation of data, and it provides a guide through disciplinary knowledge. So PhD research may use labs, fieldwork, creative-led, practice-led methods, or unobtrusive methods. But all disciplinary protocols, all disciplinary perspectives are based on reading. And that reading leads to interpretation and thinking. Now, I know critical thinking really is a cliche these days, but passionate and powerful thinking is built on the simple yet extraordinary skill of note-taking. Part 2. Shaping knowledge through information literacy. Note-taking may seem dull, but it is foundational for research. Note-taking exists so that we can control information. And there is a challenge emerging in doctoral education that we see as doctoral examiners. And I've been worried a great deal at times by the referencing of PhD students and in PhD theses. And that refers to poor referencing, inaccurate referencing, insufficient referencing, and dated references. For me, references and referencing errors are deal breakers, and we're going to talk about that a lot through this professional development program. And it is worrying when we see errors in a PhD thesis that should have been resolved at the first year of an undergraduate degree. I'm being staunch here because our research culture, academic integrity, research integrity is based on information literacy. And yes, we can talk about plagiarism and collusion, but instead I want to be much more positive and proactive and explore particularly early on here the foundational skills that examiners require from you, our foundational skills that we look for when we read your thesis. So information literacy is the capacity to locate information, but also identify the type, mode, or genre of information, how we evaluate and analyse that information, and apply that information in a new context to a new problem or a new topic. And we apply that information while maintaining the integrity of the original, intentional and informational context to ensure that high quality referencing in context is in place. Information literacy is a relatively recent concept. It was first used by Paul Zakowski in 1974, and he described it as a series of techniques and skills to use information tools to engage primary sources to solve problems. Since this first use of the term, information literacy has been aligned with democracy and social responsibility. There is an ethics to information use, particularly if we're interested in democracy. And if we are interested in democracy, then our citizens require access to high quality information and also access to the skills to interpret this information well and with clarity. In other words, we can't have social inclusion without information literacy. It is part of lifelong learning. It is part of active citizenship. But for PhD students, information literacy is part of academic integrity, because you must demonstrate that you can not only access information, but you can evaluate information and you can use it accurately and transparently. For examiners, we are verifying that you as a PhD student have mobilised a diversity of sources, including very, very current material as well as historically important material, but also that you can interpret these sources, that you're not endlessly quoting or indeed endlessly paraphrasing, depending on one's discipline. You are analysing and evaluating these sources with rigour, precision, innovation and creativity, and that you're using these sources with respect, that referencing is correct and enough information is provided so that we can check your sources and we can evaluate the quality and the calibre of your interpretation. So now that we have that definitional work in place and you have a sense of what we are after as examiners and how important information literacy is to the evaluation of your academic expertise, let me show you why it matters so much. Information is, of course, derived from the Latin informare, which means the imposition of a form. What this origin shows us is that information is about power. It's about pushing a view or perspective onto others. We live in an information age. Information is everywhere. But beyond the cliche, what does that mean? Who has the ability to manage and to shape this information? And I'm really interested in two parallel movements. Firstly, the extraordinary availability of information for the digitally literate. At the same time, as information literacy, which can be defined as finding the appropriate information for the appropriate context, has become even more difficult to attain through the decline in public funding for schools, universities, libraries, and informational infrastructure. So the problem here is not Google. The problem is a lack of knowledge and a lack of information literacy. You see, the strength and the weakness of Google is that everyone can find a little bit of information. We use our already existing knowledge and we can continually satisfy ourselves that we're sort of finding what we need. So we're hungry for information and Google provides it for us, just like we're hungry for food and a McDonald's drive-through provides it for us. We don't think about the other choices we could have made because we're sort of satisfied. But the goal of education is not to satisfy us, it's to challenge us, to confuse us, to irritate us, to unsettle us, to agitate the truths that we have accepted all our lives. The problem with Google and its search box is that we can only use the vocabulary and the search terms that we already know. So if you do not know who Etienne Balibar is, then you cannot add his name to a search in post-colonialism. So in other words, Google will always make the searcher comfortable and perhaps overconfident because we're always going to find what we already know in a language that we understand. Because we cannot put words into a search engine that we do not know. And that's the problem with Google. Because we lack information literacy, vocabulary and knowledge, Google restricts, reduces and limits. And we're not even aware that it does it. It appears to deliver a world of knowledge to our screens. But instead, it delivers a glut of poor quality information rather than selective and carefully constructed and filtered information. So inexperienced researchers use the easiest sources to find, not the best, not even better information, but simple and straightforward information. If you want to find stronger, more effective information, then that necessitates the movement between search engines, between media platforms, between perspectives. It requires that we all widen our vocabulary and that we recognise the innovative writers in our field. There has never been an easier time to find information. What is so disturbing is that a few key decisions from a researcher can make such a difference. So therefore, in our environment of information obesity, the solution is digital dieting through information literacy. So simply changing from Google to Google Scholar radically transforms the type of information the user finds. It lifts the quality by switching sources to that which is refereed, that which is reviewed by scholars. But this is trying to convince a friend about the convenience of eating an apple or eating yogurt rather than home-delivered pizza. Think about all the metaphors we use to describe our engagement with the web: scrolling, surfing, linking. Each of these describe incredibly superficial movements through material. The question is how we develop advanced interpretive skills. So think about your search patterns today. Do you use the directory of open access journals? Do you use Google Scholar or do you just use Google? The nature of literacy is all of us stay in our intellectual environments where we feel happy and understood and satiated and literate and untroubled by foreign ideas. But the starting point of learning is to have the courage to read defiantly and courageously, jumping into ideas that will confuse us, unsettle us, and upset our values, upset our experience. Challenge builds learning. Conformity and comfort enable ignorance. Information literacy requires that we make choices about our information landscape rather than allowing software to make those choices for you. So my goal as a teacher, my goal as a researcher, my goal as a supervisor is to slow down your engagement with the interpretation of information. I've assembled a checklist that I ask every source that every student at university uses in their PhD. And I ask every student to think about these 10 questions when they approach a source or a piece of information. What are those 10 questions? Here we go. 1. Who authored the information? 2. What expertise does the writer have to comment? 3. What evidence is used to make the argument? 4. What genre is the document? Journalism, academic paper, blog, polemic. 5. Is the site, document, report funded by an institution? 6. What argument is being made? 7. When was the text produced or published? 8. Why did this information emerge at this point in history? 9. Who's the audience for this information? And 10. What is not being discussed? And what are the political consequences of that absence? Think about how many of those questions you ask yourself before you believe the source that you're using in your PhD. If you ask very few of these questions, then you are not information literate. Another strategy for information literacy is to start reading your sources from the back. Look at the sources that the writer has used to make the point and evaluate the calibre of the argument on the basis of those sources. So if they've used poor source material, then don't believe them. But how often do you start your reading process at the back and look at those references? If a bloke came up to you with a funny hat on, dribbling, and with a needle hanging out of his arm, you probably wouldn't take too much notice of him. But how many of us deal with some random's ramblings online because we haven't bothered to check the sources that this person is using? Google is popular, not because it's right, not because it's appropriate, but because it's fast and because it's easy. But at a university, and particularly in a doctoral program, fast and easy is not good enough. If someone holds information literacy, then we learn from prior experiences to improve our information-seeking behaviour, and we check the credibility of sources. Only when we understand the history of information and its context can we locate, evaluate, and demonstrate our originality. And you see, that is the gift of information, because it enables us as researchers to build knowledge. Part 3. Academic and research integrity. Information literacy is powerful and important, and it is required when we're developing academic and research integrity. Academic integrity requires clear definitions. It holds an international currency. In terms of institutional reputational damage, plagiarism discovered in research higher degrees theses that's reported by international examiners is the most damaging form of academic misconduct that a university can face. So a university can be pretty well permanently damaged if a plagiarism claim emerges during a doctorate. What we have to do is to ensure that your research is excellent, original, transparent and accountable. Now, I know plagiarism suggests punishment, but internationally there's a new movement for both undergraduates and postgraduates to enable information literacy. This movement is academic integrity. Tracy Brewtag, in her remarkable Handbook of Academic Integrity, described it as, quote, critical to every aspect of the educational process, end of quote. Academic integrity is often used as synonymous with research integrity. You sometimes hear educational integrity. There are differences between these phrases, but the overlap is also really clear. Before this change in language, academic integrity was really a plagiarism policy. So before we talk through that change, let's be clear on the definitions. Academic integrity is a positive phrase, a positive suite of policies and procedures that enables information literacy, citation practices, and referencing. Curtin University, for example, focuses core values in academic integrity. So integrity is founded on honesty, trust, fairness, respect, courage, excellence, and impact. Academic integrity is at the core of higher degree programs. Academic freedom is founded on and by a community of scholars who share rights and responsibilities. Historically, this phrase emerged through the end of the 19th century, when university academics were not only required to teach, but start to publish original research. There is a relationship between academic integrity and research integrity. There is a relationship between academic misconduct and research misconduct. The Australian Research Council focuses on research integrity and research misconduct, with the goal of safeguarding the confidence in publicly funded research, with the goal of valuing peer review, grant selection processes and evaluation protocols, but also the maintenance of research standards. An integrity breach, whether it is a research breach or an academic breach, is a deviation from agreed principles. Academic misconduct and research misconduct refer to fabrication, plagiarism, fraud, deception, or falsification. It also refers to a mismanagement of conflict of interest, including the selection of PhD examiners, a failure to gain or abide by ethics clearances, and at Columbia University, academic integrity and the responsible conduct of research is aligned within a single policy. And there's a lot of focus on proper citation and attention to paraphrasing, interestingly enough. But in Australia, there was a major national policy intervention in 2018. In 2018, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research was released. It was a revision of the previous code. The 2018 version sets out broad principles confirming an honest, ethical and conscientious research culture for our researchers, but also for our higher education institutions. All national funding, including from the NHMRC, must adhere to the code, and the code is important for research training. In December 2019, the NHMRC, the ARC and Universities Australia released a document titled Supervision, a guide to supporting the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. This is a powerful document. It is a freely available document. All the excuses are over. There is no courtesy authorship. There is no, this is the way it's always been done in my field. This is the way it's always been done in my discipline. And because this is the way it's always been done, therefore you need to put my name on that article. All this stuff has gone. These unjust practices are now in breach of the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. So this new code was released in 2018, very clear instructions for authorship, very clear instructions about the requirements of what it is to be an author. The guidelines are really clear. For example, I'll read item 6 to you from that 2019 supervision guide. Quote, Examples of breaches of the code that are related to supervision include, but are not limited to, failure by a supervisor to provide adequate guidance or mentorship on the responsible conduct of research to researchers or research trainees under their supervision, or demanding or accepting authorship of a research output on the basis of supervision, where the individual does not also satisfy the authorship criteria in the authorship guide. End of quote. Most of us, through our academic lives around the world, have seen some dreadful behaviour around academic authorship. But Australia now has really powerful and strong guidelines. Just because any of us supervise a higher degree student, that has nothing to do with authorship. Nothing. All authors must prove their authorship by a set of criteria. So let me tell you about that criteria. Authors must contribute to two of the following three criteria. 1. Research design. 2. Data collection and interpretation. 3. Substantive writing and drafting. These verification protocols are important between academic colleagues, and they're incredibly important to you, our students. It is therefore important that these discussions emerge early in your candidature and are the very foundations of your research project. These agreements must be handled with decency, with transparency, and with respect. It's very important to recognise the distinctiveness of the Australian higher education system. Higher degree students own their intellectual property unless they sign it away. And these contracts need to be signed by the student early. So if there are industry partnerships in place or alternative IP collaborations in place, these negotiations need to be held early in the candidature. And without this contract, without this agreement, students own their IP. There are plenty of assumptions about authorship, particularly tethered to research supervision, and I still hear supervisors and prospective supervisors around this country state that if they supervise a person, then they are going to expect an authorship credit. But assumptions are not enough. Assumptions may be in the breach of the Code of Conduct. In response to the Code, academic integrity and misconduct is also transforming. For research higher degree students and supervisors, this manifests in two ways. Yes, there is a focus on plagiarism through the candidature, but there's also a focus on plagiarism discovered during the examination process. So while the processes to discover academic misconduct, particularly plagiarism through the examination process, are clear and have not changed, it is important that we all talk about how academic misconduct is managed through the candidature. So, for example, can a draft exchanged between a supervisor and a student be an example of academic misconduct? So that means you send your supervisor a draft and your supervisor believes you haven't cited something correctly, and then you're charged with alleged academic misconduct and you have to go through the university processes. So this is quite a troubling scenario, which I have seen. And one of the troubling bits of this story is, what is the status of a draft? Is the draft submitted to a supervisor submitted and accessible work? So universities around the world have got themselves into a bit of trouble when supervisors who don't like their students and would like their students to no longer be in their supervisory suite, they then cry plagiarism on a minor draft to remove that student from their supervision. So this gets quite messy, and this is a real threat. At one of my former universities, a very unhappy supervisor cried plagiarism on a student draft, and I had to investigate it as the head of school using undergraduate regulations. But therefore, is the draft you give a supervisor accessible work like an undergraduate essay? Well, I would argue no, But the ambiguity can cause you, as a student, a huge amount of stress and trouble. So clearly the final thesis is accessible, but are the weekly drafts exchanged between supervisors and students of that same status? Well, what we've done now at Charles Darwin University, and many universities around the country have also done this, is we've intensified the importance of the milestones that are held each year. And we make text matching software available for every student to use. So text matching software is like Turnitin or Authenticate. And I want students to use it not as a punishment. I want you to use it as a diagnostic for you to check your own note-taking, quoting, paraphrasing abilities throughout your candidature. By you enacting this diagnostic, it builds transparency so that you and your supervisor can discuss your rigour, your intellectual levels of scholarship, but also you can discuss academic integrity, academic misconduct, and therefore discuss a lot more in the conversation than simply plagiarism. Yes, collusion is a significant variable too. It is part of the academic misconduct suite, but it is rare in doctoral education. It involves working together on a submission that was meant to be the result of individual work. The line between collusion and collaboration can get messy in undergraduate experiences, but the difference is collusion involves deceit. The students lie about the work they've done with another person, and they represent the work as a result of individual effort. Where it may have a bearing on the work we do is we have to make sure that every bit of published work during the doctoral program is correctly cited with clear presentations of the percentage of work completed by others in terms of research design, data collection and analysis, and the writing and editing up of that research. Remember, examiners need to know that this is your work. Simply listing yourself as the first author is not enough. Examiners need to know with full transparency what is your role, what is your role in each stage of the research. For those of us working in doctoral and master's education, we must make sure that you have all the professional development skills you require. Referencing, high-level writing skills, but also research ethics, ensuring that your methods are well deployed, that your evidence is correctly cited and it's not invented. The point of academic integrity in doctoral education is to ensure that the original contribution to knowledge that you create can be transparently confirmed, checked, and verified throughout the process of your candidature. So your ethics clearances, your methods, your footnotes. Now, all of this seems simple enough. And yes, software can make a difference, and I would recommend the use of text matching software. Run your work through Turnitin as a draft, and make sure that you exclude quotations. And don't overinvest in the number. Look at the text matching that is revealed. And that's why it's important to click the exclude quotations little bar. This may reveal work you have published, right? So it's very important to look at those matches and state and reference the components of the thesis that have been published. So cite your own work and put that citation in. So your use of Turnitin in draft is not a punishment. It's available for you to check your work first, before your supervisor, before your examiners. And this is how you learn, and this is how you improve your information literacy. Our job is to care for you, to make sure that you have the skills that you need and that you are supported in the development of academic and research integrity. Part 4, Plagiarism and Your PhD. I want to talk with you in this part about plagiarism culture and how we avoid it in doctoral programs. Plagiarism has never been easier to do, and it's never been easier to detect. And I'm going to talk about why this is happening and how you can avoid it. I'll also tell you the signs that I look for as an examiner when I'm worried about plagiarism in a PhD. I know this topic upsets and worries students, so let's talk about it in a way that's relaxed and contextualised, but also very practical. Most of us, when talking about digitisation, we use words like efficiency, productivity, connectivity. Great words, but what is rarely mentioned is one of the causes of this efficiency is that an array of functions in our daily lives are now automated and displaced from our patterns of conscious decision-making. So in the old days, we would read a book and take analogue notes with a pen and a notebook. And this was careful, it was considered, but it was also slow. Now we read on a computer and take notes on our computer, and through cutting and pasting, there's all this movement between ideas, and it's quick. And it's easy, but it's sometimes sloppy. We think we're saving time, but we're actually cutting corners, and that has some consequences. When I enrolled at the University of Western Australia in Perth for my first degree, there was no mention of plagiarism. None. But compare this situation to our present. I run inductions for new students. I've done so since 1997. And each year, plagiarism has crept further and further up the agenda of these inductions. So Turnitin, Authenticate, text matching software, it manages plagiarism. It catches plagiarism. It censors the cheaters. But are we missing something in this story? Indeed, are we missing the actual story? And that's why I stressed in our last part that we need to talk about Turnitin as a diagnostic, because it helps us see and develop information literacy. There is, of course, a bigger question, a meta question. Why, in the last 25 years, has plagiarism moved from relatively invisible to pretty well the key scholarly crime in our universities? And I argue that plagiarism is a proxy. It's a strategy to blame the victim rather than consider what has actually happened to higher education in the last 25 years. We are now living with and living through the consequences of quick and cheap fixes for teaching and learning for 2 decades. How does this impact on all of you? Well, for me, there are 5 issues, challenges and shortcuts for you to think about. The key variable for you to consider is speed. Most acts of plagiarism are not intentional. They emerge from taking shortcuts. They emerge from letting the technology determine your behaviour rather than information literacy determining your behaviour. So let's just talk about 5 issues that you can make a decision to manage today, and they will have a huge impact on your doctoral examination. The first is cutting and pasting. So note-taking is a specialist skill. Too often, digitisation enables us to take shortcuts via cutting and pasting. The problem is that cutting and pasting the words of others into your thesis means that when you're tired, which of course for a doctoral student is most of the time, it means that you can lose track of what are your words here. What is the quotation? So the shortcut, the cut and paste, can create sloppiness and can create trouble. So be aware of it. And that's why I always recommend taking notes on a different platform from the one you're reading on. So paper to computer, iPad to computer. Create space for thought, and that will slow down your reading, your interpretation and your note-taking. 2, watch your brackets. Harvard referencing poses particular challenges. It encourages paraphrasing, and it means that the line between paraphrasing and independent interpretation is unclear. As an examiner, I'm on plagiarism alert during a PhD when I see one thing, and I see it quite often, can I say. I see a paragraph of writing from a student with a Harvard bracketed reference at the end. So there are 10 sentences and then bracket, Brabazon 2023, end of bracket. Now I see that and I immediately start doing a plagiarism check. The student has not specified what is cited from the scholar's work, what is the PhD student's interpretation of the featured scholar, what is the original interpretation from the student, arching beyond the researcher. So be clear in your note-taking and your writing. Specify what is the paraphrase, put your bracketed reference there, put your footnote there, and then move to your interpretation. Never position a bracketed reference at the end of a paragraph. 3. Managing feedback, editing and drafting. It is important that you write and draft on both paper and screens. We see and find different errors through distinct drafting processes, so use both screens and paper and keep yourself fresh. Continue to defamiliarise your relationship with your own writing. And when you do that, you pick up new errors and improve your arguments. Reading on paper takes longer. It's more thorough than reading on a screen. At its most basic, a screen is a different shape to a piece of A4 paper. So what happens is, if examiners particularly are reading on paper, they're able to evaluate paragraph construction and the development of ideas in a much more fluid fashion. A4 is bigger than a screen. You can monitor the flow of ideas. Also recognise what screens do to your reading and your note-taking. So, for example, through a series of JISC studies, they demonstrated that the screen encourages superficial reading, with eyes rolling around a text rather than reading it deeply. So superficiality is the enemy of PhD research. 4. Orientations and inductions matter. It is very important at the start of a doctorate that a clear diagnostic is done, and it's never too late to do that diagnostic. You and your supervisors must be honest and compassionate when you understand the skills that you hold, but also you understand the skills that you will require. And look, this might be software expertise in EndNote. Therefore, activate the expertise of librarians in the library. It might be writing skills. Okay, we'll join our weekly writing club. It's called Write Club. Join it. Referencing skills. There are great sessions available in our libraries to teach you referencing. Understand the difference between methods and theories. Go to as many sessions and seminars as possible in your faculties, in your research centres. Only when we know what we don't know can we fix it. So right now, list down the skills that you are comfortable that you hold. But also be aware of the skills that you would like to and perhaps you need to develop. And yes, 5. Here we go. Keep the level of reading high. There has never been a time when there's more low-quality material available online. The problem is that low-quality source material rarely creates high-quality scholarship. When I examine theses these days, I see too many low-quality references, textbooks, blogs, non-refereed material. Now, I am not saying don't use this material. You should use this material, but you must create a balance. Remember that you need to use high-quality material to create a quality doctorate. You need to read material that will stretch you, read material that you find difficult. It's very easy to read blogs and textbooks. They're easy to read, but they are not the foundation for a PhD. PhDs are meant to be tough, and that is why the PhD is still an elite qualification. Therefore, make sure that you read the best, the most advanced, and the most verified scholarship, and write it with clarity, precision, and yes, care. Part 5. The do's and don'ts of paraphrasing, quoting and plagiarism. There are delicate filaments that separate and connect paraphrasing, quoting and plagiarism. Academic literacy professionals teach these terms as if the differences are quite stark. But in real life, the movement between paraphrasing and plagiarism, quoting and plagiarism, can be as little as a couple of squiggles, and we happen to call those squiggles inverted commas. This section provides some quick do's, some quick don'ts to improve your academic writing immediately. So let's start with the positives, the do's. 1. Write short sentences. The first truth of writing is that each sentence conveys one idea. Students get themselves into trouble with long sentences, so write strong topic sentences that start each paragraph. Focus on constructing paragraphs that are like a waterfall. They flow. I think students get into trouble when they write these impossibly long sentences and have no sense of how a paragraph is created. The key is to treat a sentence as a stepping stone. A quotation is certainly one of those stepping stones, and use them because they get you somewhere. 2. Make sure that your paraphrasing reduces the length of the original text. If students paraphrase an original statement from a researcher and it's longer than the original, then the student actually doesn't understand the original and they don't understand what paraphrasing is meant to do. So make sure your paraphrasing is tight, succinct and short. Paraphrasing should be shorter than the original statement. 3. Be confident in your abilities. I think one of the causes of plagiarism and collusion in particular is a lack of confidence in students. Students buy a paper or they buy a thesis from a paper mill, and this never ends, by the way, very well, because at a doctoral level, the thesis you buy will not be of examinable standard. And you won't get through the milestones of your candidature, which must show scaffolded written work to your thesis. But the reason students are desperate for help, which may be legal or otherwise, is because they're frightened of failure, because they doubt their abilities. So we have an array of support structures and professional development strategies available to help you today through your degree. So don't buy expertise, develop your own, and be confident in your abilities and be confident in what you can achieve. 4. Write clear topic sentences in your paragraphs. I think a great problem of and with quotations is the positioning of the quotation in the paragraph. The best way to frame quotations, paraphrasing and the research of others is to make sure that the topic sentence of your paragraphs is evocative. Now, just to clarify, if you've never heard the phrase topic sentence before, the topic sentence is the first sentence of every paragraph. And what happens is they form the spine of your argument. You show that you're able to read the first sentence of every paragraph and you gain a trajectory and a momentum for an argument. By the way, this is a really good way to draft your thesis. Read the first sentence of every paragraph in a chapter. Does the chapter make sense? It should. If this topic sentence is sharp, precise and powerful, then it eases the positioning of the quotation for you in the middle, in the meat of the paragraph. Remember, never start nor end a paragraph with a quotation. It must be embedded into the meat of your paragraph. And 5, never leave quotations to be self-standing sentences. The key to understanding the positioning of quotations and paraphrasing in your sentences, in your paragraphs, in your chapters is to insert the quotation carefully into your prose. The number one priority to remember is The longer the paragraph, the more intricate the argument. Now, if I, as an examiner, see single sentence paragraphs, I know that the PhD student does not possess the scale of the interpretation and the knowledge required to complete a doctorate. The longer the paragraph, the better the analysis. Remember to introduce your quotations. Never present the quotation as a self-standing sentence like, use sentences like as Brabazon states, comma, and then the quotation. And then you follow that quotation, short quotation, with paraphrasing. And then you follow it with your interpretation. So as you can see, long paragraphs create a very strong interpretation. So let's now move to the don'ts. Don't be a lazy note taker. Some acts of plagiarism and academic misconduct are intentional. Some are not. Laziness is also a cause. So if students do not know how to take good notes, it's ignorance. If they're sloppy and they lack attention to detail, then that is laziness. Simple errors like not differentiating between a quotation and a paraphrase, not differentiating between your ideas and the ideas of others can get you into real trouble. Note-taking is powerful, so treat it with respect and attention to detail. Next don't is avoid overquoting. Quoting is important. It demonstrates intellectual integrity. It demonstrates respect for knowledge and respect for the way in which some of the greatest scholars on the planet have expressed their ideas. So quoting matters, but overquoting is a problem. Overquoting is a sign of an underconfident student because the student remains wedded to already existing research rather than stretching to create their own interpretation. There is a structural rule that I use to solve this problem, and I ask that for every sentence of quotation that a student uses, that the student then writes 3 sentences in interpretation. So a 1 to 3 mix is very strong. To help you a bit more, let me break down those 3 sentences for you. So the first sentence paraphrases the quotation. The second sentence explains why the quotation is important, and the third sentence explains why the quotation is important for your research and your argument. So this is the 1 to 3 rule, and it means that you'll stop using those really, really long quotations, because if you do, think about how many sentences you're going to have to write. So always remember that you're using quotations to make your argument. You're using quotations as a scaffold. You're not simply restating the words of others because it's convenient. The next don't is don't dumb down your research. When all of us are reading difficult material, we become frightened and worried. But the key with reading the really tough stuff is to keep reading it. I remember the first time I read Althusser, I got about 25% of it. But I was inspired to such an extent that I read it again, and I read it again, and I read it again. So don't reduce the level of your scholarship because the reading is tough. You are judged by the calibre of your reading. Examiners go to your bibliography. They go to your reading list first. And that's how I know if it's going to be a pass or a fail. I know, and your examiners know, what sort of scholar you are by the level of your reading. The next don't is don't rely on editors. Even though the Australian Council for Graduate Research has agreed to the use of editors in doctoral education, this is a pretty controversial issue. People are pretending it's not, but it is. Don't rely on an editor and think that an editor will get your thesis through. Just to be clear, I have never used an editor for any of my PhD students. I don't believe in it, but I have lost that battle. Please remember to learn good and effective writing skills, and you should be learning those from your supervisor. You should be learning how to write. You should be learning how to edit, and please only use an editor as your last resort. And here's our final don't. Don't confuse the how of the thesis with the why. Please remember, writing literature reviews, that's easy. Writing methods chapters, that's easy. The what and the how are straightforward, really easy. The why am I doing this thesis? Why now? Why does my scholarship matter? Yep, that's the tough stuff. So please make sure that you do not confuse the what, the how, and the why. The what and the how are easy. The why, that's how you pass the examination of a PhD. Part 6. The Changing Face of Plagiarism. Artificial intelligence is transforming the nature of writing, editing, and the detection of plagiarism. But ChatGPT is only one part of the changing face of plagiarism. The submission process for a PhD is transforming. Your thesis is now run through text matching software. Your supervisor signs off that this thesis maintains research integrity and that plagiarism is not present. And as Dean, I go through every line of every thesis that is submitted. I'm looking, yes, at what the software has told me, but I'm also looking at your referencing style and your citation patterns. I do this because the worst thing that can happen to you during an examination is an examiner locates plagiarism in a thesis. The entire process stops, and no examination can continue until this matter has been discharged. Yes, we have had examiners claim self-plagiarism from a student. The student published a refereed article during the candidature and then configured it in the thesis. An examiner described that as self-plagiarism. We had a student using captions taken from a table or a photograph from an article where the caption was not cited, and that was also described as plagiarism by an examiner. So as you can see, this is a difficult, messy, and challenging space, and it also transforms our very discussion of research and authorship, because all of a sudden shame, blame, and embarrassment enter this conversation, whispers in the corridor, fears, and probably some paranoia. And indeed, self-plagiarism is adding all sorts of unnecessary complications to this issue. Let me explain what's going on. In the editorial of Volume 70, Issue Number 4, in the Gerontological Society of America's editorial in 2019 by Anne Newman, she reported the retraction of an article in March 2019 on chronic inflammation. The article was withdrawn because it used patch writing. That is, copying sections of other articles without acknowledging the earlier researcher's work. What the author Bertrand Forger did was gather up paragraphs from 13 articles, bringing the references with those paragraphs. So the journal software picked up Forger's self-plagiarism from his previous article, but missed the 13 other articles that had paragraphs nicked from them. So really, self-plagiarism was the least of the worries with this article, and indeed the editor's comments were pretty desperately trying to confirm the reputation of the journal, that yes, the journal remained solid, the editorial board was solid. But the phrase was used, quote, "It is becoming increasingly difficult to judge the quality of information with a large number of media outlets." End of quote. Is that true? Well, what we're learning from this case is that plagiarism is changing and cutting and pasting is transforming into patching. So while we are reliant on software, our wetware, our information literacy skills are decentered, marginalised or ignored until a crisis emerges, like this current crisis around AI. Anne Newman, the editor of that journal, could only make the self-evident and pretty embarrassing comment that, quote, with increasing reliance on electronic media, it is common for people to take notes using a cut and paste technique. It is very difficult to keep track of what is original writing versus copied writing, end of quote. This statement was made by a professor in the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. It is not difficult to keep track of reading, research, note-taking and writing. These are simple, basic academic skills. But what is clear is that plagiarism is changing and it is showing us new faces. Plagiarism has a history and a context and indeed a geography. The meaning of plagiarism changes through time and holds different meanings in different places. It is an historical term. It has many stakeholders, like researchers, PhD students, journals, editors, universities. The definition that holds dominance at this point is plagiarism is the use of material without appropriate citation. Most frequently, this material refers to written material, but images, artwork, tables, figures can also be used without citation. Plagiarised materials can emerge from published or unpublished sources, and when it becomes really messy is at what point does plagiarism kick in? And by that I mean, so using 4 words that are relatively common modes of expression, that's not plagiarism. But if a student dances too closely around an original text, so paraphrasing and plagiarism start to conflate, then that is the dangerous pathway. As to the appropriate scope or scale of citations or references, there really is a limit to the scale of material that can be used. So if too much of another work is used, even with references, then that can become a copyright breach. So this is about ethics, it's about law, it's about information literacy. But most importantly, I think the new face of plagiarism involves a new phrase: the plagiarism of ideas. This is the most insidious form of plagiarism. An academic attends a professional meeting, views a poster, or attends a seminar about a work in progress, and then enacts that identical experiment or works with that concept, that theory, that argument, and then publishes it, noting the quick turnaround time on many journals. This is the plagiarism of ideas. It is very, very difficult to prove. My solution, which I have enacted with my students and indeed in my own research, is to record a podcast on the research that is public, open access and can be cited. These early ideas are available and available for people to cite. For my PhD students, we do early and often podcasts for their research, and that therefore lessens the chance of the plagiarism of ideas, and if it emerges, then we can prove the dated rendering of an earlier version. Similarly, beware of patchwork or mosaic plagiarism. Now, I knew this was a thing before it had a name. I once read an article where a quarter of it was taken from one of my articles. Now, my work at that time was rare. I had created the first article in a new field. But the academic did reference my work. He put one Harvard reference at the end of 3 pages citing my article. So the challenge is the citation was there, but the inverted commas paraphrasing was very poor. This type of behaviour now has a name. It's called patchwork or mosaic paraphrasing. So you're not taking work from one source, but multiple sources, and then taking the multiple patches to create a new cloth. But no, if you're lifting work from other people like this, the multiplicity of those sources doesn't make this situation any better. This is patchwork plagiarism. So take good notes, develop your own interpretations, and always focus and write the words. Focus on what you are developing. Focus on what you believe is new. and then use explanatory footnotes. I'm a big believer in explanatory footnotes. This is that big footnote that provides evidence to make a point, and that's particularly valuable, I think, in our plagiarism discussion. Let me use an example of what I mean here. Say you're making an argument or you're presenting a key consensual point in your discipline. Now, at that point, I often place an explanatory footnote stating that this research or this idea has been developed by these specific scholars. Or I make the point that this argument I'm making in this context has been discussed in earlier stages or different contexts or different disciplines by the following scholars. And I list the references. This is valuable information, and it confirms the history of your references and the history of your ideas. And finally, remember that you are responsible for all the work in your articles, including the work produced by your co-authors. Saying you did not write that section of the article if a plagiarism issue emerges is not a justification, because all authors sign off that they are responsible for the published version. That is the Australian Code of Conduct. So when I'm writing with other people, I allow them to draft the entire work so they're satisfied, and then I draft the entire work and I check every quotation and I check the references. Then I put the entire draft through text matching software as a final check, and I look carefully at the report, not simply at the number. Because co-authorship is not a pass for plagiarism. Therefore, use the plagiarism discussion with co-authors to explore the very nature of authorship. Plagiarism asks us to explore who owns what, who wrote what. And if we include people as co-authors in articles that have no idea what's going on, then that is a disrespect of authorship. If you're added to an article, then you don't know what is plagiarised. And remember, authorship is about responsibility. Responsibility for content. If you don't know what other people have done in this article, then you have a good chance of getting pinged for plagiarism. You need to check, you need to verify, you need to confirm. Now, I know there's a lot of abuse of research administration as wasting time, but we need to transform our thinking. Research administration is part of research. The rights of authorship are also the responsibilities of authorship. Authorship is about acknowledgement. Authorship is about disclosure, confirming the ideas that you've developed and the ideas that you have used from others. So be really clear in this differentiation and use referencing to confirm this differentiation. Plagiarism is a warning to us, it's a warning for us. But like all warnings, it asks that we reflect on our practice. We reflect on our truths and the normalities that we take for granted. Plagiarism is a lighthouse in academic life. See the warning and find your path in a safe and meaningful direction. Part 7. The deal-breaking errors in references and referencing as discovered by examiners. We conclude our professional development session on academic authorship with integrity by getting real, by getting direct and becoming really, really clear. We are exploring the deal-breaking errors, the errors that undermine your credibility and mean that your thesis will be treated with suspicion and concern rather than respect. In probably the most quoted statement in any writing I've done in my career, I described the bibliography as the canary in the PhD coal mine. So what did I mean? Well, it was a metaphor, but a pretty appropriate one, because miners would carry caged canaries into mine tunnels because the birds would respond to the carbon monoxide before the humans, and the canary would die before the miners. It's actually the same with the bibliography. I know that a thesis is going to meet an untimely end, an untimely result, when I read the reference list. So today, in this part, this final stage in our professional development, here are the 8 key tips, really the 8 key errors that are the canary in the mine of your thesis. When I see these 8 issues, I know we're in trouble. Now, the oddity is these are really straightforward errors, and I'm going to list them for you and explain what they mean. So please remember, the majority of examiners start examining your thesis at the back. We read the reference list first, and I know if you're going to pass or fail from that reference list. It is the canary in the mine of your doctorate. First tip: size of the reference list. The bigger the bibliography or reference list, the more you have read, the harder you have worked, the more expansive your scholarship, the more conclusive your findings. A short reference list shows laziness, unrepresentativeness, and an issue and problem of level, scope, and scale. If you have a reference list more in keeping with an honours or a coursework master's degree or a capstone project, then you will fail your PhD. The reference list must be large and comprehensive. 2. Date of the research in the reference list. There are many reasons we try and help you finish your thesis as quickly as possible. And one is, the longer your candidature goes on, the more dated your reference list appears. It is so common that we see an examiner's report from students that have taken a long time where the examiners note the reference list is dated, because we cannot prove an original contribution to knowledge if we haven't read the current, recent and relevant literature. Because what happens is the research looks tired. The literature review looks dated. You have not demonstrated that you know what is going on in your field today. I always say to my students, and your fields may be different, but I always make sure that at least 1/5 of all of my students' references emerge 2 years before the submission of their doctorate. 3. Incorrect referencing. This is a deal breaker. I see incorrect referencing. I see a PhD student who does not know how to reference and gets the selected style wrong. Yep, it's over. There is no way back from this fundamental error. If you can't reference, then you lack the fundamental academic skill for research. 4. Inconsistent referencing. Students use 2 different styles of referencing in their thesis, so they decide they're going to use Harvard and Chicago footnotes. Why are you doing this? Please pick a style and stick to it. 5. Awkwardly positioned references. This issue is a particular characteristic of the Harvard referencing style. This problem emerges when a student plonks a bracketed reference seemingly arbitrarily into a particular point in their prose. So always ask yourself, what is the relationship between the sentences and the paragraph you have written and the positioning of your reference? Few things make me crazier in life than a bracketed Harvard reference at the end of a paragraph. And I just can't see the relationship between the prose and the reference. So here's a paragraph, and I've just plonked a reference at the end of that paragraph. So please explain your reference. Interpret your reference. References should never be left to speak for themselves. 6. The blind spot bibliography. Oh yeah, so this problem emerges during the first reading of a reference list or a bibliography by an examiner. And what we see is particular scholars are overrepresented to the detriment of others. So the obsessions of either the student or the supervisor are revealed, and this is patchy research and it's unrepresentative. Often, inexperienced supervisors create this problem. They have a particular fixation on a particular approach or theory or theorist or methodology, and they pretty sadly drag their student into their obsession. But of course, the examiners want something different. We want balance. We want you to make an argument. Explain to us, why are you using a particular method or theory? Why? And what other alternatives are available? I see this problem emerge in reference lists where references cluster around one name. And often it was a pretty famous name, but a famous name from 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. The debates have moved on, and the names of the scholars who have moved on those debates are not in your bibliography. So as you can see, the cultish obsession with one scholarly method or one approach, that is a problem. We all must make the argument. We must not assume the argument. 7, lack of diversity in sources. We've never had so much information, high quality information, as right now. We've never had such a diversity of platforms to carry research as we do right now. So when I see a reference list that does not move around the diversity of possible source materials, then it shows a lack of research skills. So a domination of books, a domination of black literature, a domination of refereed articles from a finite number of journals, not working between analogue and digital relationships and platforms. And I don't see any podcasts, I don't see any videos, I don't see any conference proceedings, grey literature. There's nothing there that's unusual or interesting or quirky. Now, when these types of sources are shown and revealed in a bibliography, it demonstrates completeness. It demonstrates high-level information literacy skills and multimodality. 8, Eurocentrism. If a student has another form of citation black spot, and this black spot has many meanings in this context, it is a focus on the US, Canada, and British authors and researchers, ignoring the rest of the world, which of course also includes the bulk of the world's population, the bulk of the world's universities. Neocolonialism lives in academia and in academic publishing, and I give major credit to students who have sought out new and emerging researchers, journals and research. And I'm very impressed when multiple languages have been accessed, even in translation. It is a big, glorious, scholarly world out there, and it's much larger than Europe and North America. Be a scholar of the world. Cite the world. 9, warped perspective. The point of research is transparency, accountability and repeatability. These 3 goals are undermined when your bibliography is warped into a particular direction. You've often heard me say what we don't talk about is often more important than what we do talk about. And in many ways, I developed that maxim after reading Bruno Latour and his famous book, Science in Action, How to Follow Scientists and Engineers Through Society. Latour stated, quote, "The presence or the absence of references, quotations and footnotes is so much a sign that a document is serious or not that you can transform a fact into fiction or fiction into a fact by just adding or subtracting references." End of quote. How we cut up and erase the literature is profoundly serious for all disciplines. If you intentionally or unintentionally skew your references, examiners will see it. And most of us, when we do see it, will summon that quotation from Latour and notice that you're trying to transform a fact into fiction or a fiction into fact. You've heard me describe doctoral examination as a dark art, and it is. But a recent study by Golding et al. In the journal Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education confirmed that although examiners approach every thesis wanting it to pass, their first impressions very quickly change their mind. Further, they show that when an examiner finds referencing errors, they read the entire thesis more critically. Because if those simple errors are made, what else is going wrong with it? So when we address these errors, we are allowing you as a researcher to verify and demonstrate that as a researcher, you are not limited by your errors. Because it is a privilege to research. Research is built on the academic foundations of reading and writing, thinking and reflecting, note-taking and synthesizing, building and developing. If a significant original contribution to knowledge is to be created, it is built on the solid foundations of academic and research integrity. Thank you so much for accompanying me through this training session. I wish you every future success, and I look forward to talking with you soon.